I'm Newt Gingrich. Welcome to What If, History That Might Have Been, the series that we're doing to explore the idea that history wasn't fixed, it wasn't inevitable. It's not just something you memorize, but it teaches you lessons and gets you to think about things. Now, Brian Thomas sent in a note, and all of you who are watching can send us ideas, and we encourage that because it enriches what we're doing. And Brian Thomas sent a note and said, what if the U.S. had not intervened in Korea in 1950? I think this is a terrific question because there was really a moment of choice. It wasn't clear when in fact the North Koreans were shocked that we did intervene. What had happened was that the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, had given a speech and had said that the United States defense lines in Asia included Taiwan and included Japan, but he somehow, for some reason, skipped South Korea. Well, the North Koreans read that speech and they said to themselves, aha, he is signaling that he doesn't care what happens in South Korea. So on June 25th, 1950, to I think the great shock of everyone, the North Korean army came across the border. It was a very well-trained army, a very well-equipped army. The Soviets had done a good job of preparing their puppet to be effective, and they shattered the South Korean army. What was more sobering to the United States was when our troops went into combat initially, they were undertrained, under-equipped, unprepared, and we took substantial losses, and we were shocked to discover that we really weren't prepared to stand up to the North Koreans as armed, equipped, and trained by the Soviets. And so it took us about 2 months to begin to regain our balance because our initial troops simply weren't prepared. The danger of a peacetime military, if you are not careful, is that it loses its cutting edge, it loses its fighting ability, and then you pay in human cost with your young men and women when they're sacrificed to buy time in order to prepare a better force. We did, by mid-September, have a very powerful force that increasingly defeated the North Korean army, which is a different story. But I want to go back to this question. President Truman didn't have to go in. He could have said that's a local fight, it's a civil war, it's between Koreans, we're not involved. And the North Koreans clearly would have occupied South Korea almost overnight. Now, why did that matter? That signal of weakness. And remember, this was a generation, President Truman represented the generation that had fought in World War I, had watched the rise of Adolf Hitler, watched the rise of the militarist Japans, watched the rise of Mussolini. And so they had had this experience. They thought that if you are weak in front of dictators, they get hungrier. They want more. As Churchill once said, when you feed the crocodile, it gets bigger and bigger until it finally eats you. And so their lesson that they had taken out of World War II and out of the 1930s was that you had to stand up to this kind of dictatorship. There's a terrific small book by Pat Frank called Hold Back the Night, which is a study of the Marines at the Chosin Reservoir. And he captures in the early parts of the book the sense of that generation that they'd fought World War II, and by God, if they had to do it again, let's get it over with. They're going to stand up to the dictator and prove that the United States would defend its allies. And so it was because we were calling back a lot of reservists who had been trained and fought in World War II in order to be able to deal with this North Korean attack. I think had Truman said, you know, let's just have a UN resolution, let's not get involved, let's try to be diplomatic about it, the signal that would have sent to both Beijing, where the brand new communist dictatorship had taken over in 1949 and Mao Zedong was in charge, and the signal it would have sent to Stalin and the Soviet Union would have been a signal of weakness, which would have led them to test us somewhere else. And there were a lot of other places they could have tested us that would have been far more dangerous. Remember, by 1950, we had been through the Berlin crisis. The first great Berlin crisis, of course, is when Stalin and the Soviets cut off the highway and the railroad to stop all transportation going into Berlin. Now, Berlin was an occupied city. There's a four-power city: Britain, France, the United States, and Russia. Or the Soviet Union as it was called back then. But it was inside East Germany, and East Germany was a Soviet satellite. So Stalin actually tested us first in 1948 by cutting off the railroad and cutting off the highway just to see what we would do and to see if he could force us into negotiating. Truman rose to that occasion used American air power, created what was called the Berlin Airlift. And as a result of using American air power, we were delivering coal by airplane. I mean, we kept the city of Berlin alive by the use of air power, something we had mastered in World War II, particularly going into China over the Himalayan mountains. And so we had enough capability that we could actually keep an entire city alive just with air power. Stalin knew that if he began shooting down our airplanes, that would lead to war. He didn't want war. He wanted to see how far he could bully us, how far he could push us. Ultimately, they collapsed, they gave up, and the Berlin crisis, the initial Berlin air crisis disappeared. So Truman had seen constant efforts by the Soviets to push us around, to push us in Persia, or Iran as it's now called, to push us around in Eastern Europe. And so I think from Truman's perspective, a direct across-the-border frontal attack was simply unacceptable. And he knew that if he was weak, that we'd immediately in the next 6 months or a year have another push somewhere else, and it would just keep getting worse. That's why he did it. I think, frankly, had we backed down, had we shown a level of weakness that the Soviets would never have understood, that would have led to a bigger war, a greater threat, and possibly to a Soviet effort to overrun Western Europe, which could have led to a truly calamitous nuclear event. So I think Truman did the right thing. It was my dad served in Korea in 1953. It's a very expensive war. If you ever go to Washington, the monument that's there on the mall of the American Infantry Unit in Korea is very sobering. A lot of people died protecting freedom, but I think in the end, the alternative would have been much more dangerous and might have led to a much bigger war. So it's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. And I encourage all of you, if you find these things useful in getting you to think about new ideas, let your friends and neighbors know so they can sign up for What If. Welcome to another segment of What If, history that could have been. An effort to get us to think about history and look at it as a dynamic, not just a frozen, fossilized, static experience. What If really looks at interesting ideas, interesting questions, and most of them now come from folks who are subscribers to What If. Beverly Jones sent in one that the more I thought about it, the more I thought it was fascinating. She said, what if the United States had not become a republic? And I got to thinking about the fact that there are at least 3 different ways that the United States could have failed. I mean, we look back and we take it for granted that the founding fathers, after they won independence from Great Britain, would ultimately go to Philadelphia, write a constitution, convince the 13 independent states, as they had now become, to ratify it, and create a country which was both united and a country which was a republic within the rule of law. All seems obvious looking backwards. But let's look forward. There was a real effort towards the end of the Revolutionary War by a number of the officers to get George Washington to take power, to be a dictator. This was a pattern which they were familiar with because in the English Civil War a century earlier, Cromwell had taken over and had run England as a dictatorship until his death. So they knew it was possible for a military strongman to take over and run the country. In addition, there was a certain bias in favor of strong leadership and against this sloppy, messy idea of people electing their leaders. So you could have had, with a different personality than Washington, somebody who, after all, Washington by that stage both had the only army in the country and he was the most famous man in the country. So he might have taken control. He refused to because, as he pointed out, he did not rebel against George III in order to become George I. And as he reminded his officers, they would have violated and repudiated everything they had fought for in seeking freedom. But it's possible, in another circumstance, in a different what-if kind of world, that you would have had a Washington who succumbed to the temptation. When Washington did turn down power and did go to Annapolis to meet with the Congress to turn in his sword in a remarkable moment, which is captured in the Maryland Capitol. You can go see the room, and you can see they've built statues who are sitting there because the Congress, as the superior, sat while George Washington, as the subordinate, stood. And he came by and he gave him the sword. King George III said if he actually does that, he'll be the greatest man of the century. He did do it, and he was the greatest man of the century. But in terms of what Beverly asked about, he might have become a dictator in the Cromwellian tradition. There's a second possibility, and that is that the states just didn't get together, that there was too much jealousy. Virginia was by far the biggest and the richest state. It had a lot of vested interest in bringing the whole country together. But there were other places, Rhode Island, North Carolina, Georgia, they weren't all that convinced they wanted to be one country. In fact, the whole idea was a little bit strange to them. They'd been 13 colonies, reporting to London. Now they'd won their independence. And you could imagine a circumstance where 3 or 4 or 5 of those states would have said, no, we're not going to join. We're going to go off on our own. And you'd have had a very different future for the North American continent if you had had 3 or 4 or 5 governments, not just one government. There's a third possibility, and that is that they got together, they briefly formed a republic, the Constitution briefly worked, but after Washington retired and his prestige was gone and the sense of his leadership was gone, that it just collapsed because people decided it was too hard and they distrusted each other too much. So there were, I think, Beverly, real opportunities that the America we know, unified country, the rule of law, the power of the Constitution, the belief that power is loaned to people and they have to give it back, all of those things could have been very different. And if they had been, the world would have been very different. Because it was the American experience, as Lincoln himself put it 80 years later, it was the American experience that common, everyday people could govern themselves. That was the revolutionary moment. That was the moment when all of a sudden the world of kings and queens, of emperors and empresses began to dissolve as people realized they could, in fact, have power. They could, in fact, make decisions about their own lives. They didn't have to accept being dominated by somebody else. So it's a great question. Certainly got me to think about some things I had not thought about in a good while. And I think it offers us really good food for thought that, you know, there were many histories that could have been, and these were 3 of them. So thank you, Beverly, very much.
George Washington, do solemnly swear.
He's the father of our country because at a time when we were being torn apart, he held us together with his rectitude and his honor.
I'm Newt Gingrich, and I want to welcome you to What If? History That Could Have Been. I want to thank those of you who've been telling your friends about it, because we have a lot of new folks signing up to think about what might have been in history. And today I'm going to talk about a particular idea that Josh Martin wrote in. Josh wrote and asked, what would have happened if we'd succeeded at the Bay of Pigs? Remember, the Bay of Pigs is the invasion of Cuban freedom fighters in 1961, designed to overthrow Castro. It fails, and it fails largely because the U.S. refuses to provide the level of support needed for it to succeed. So when you go back to that period, President Eisenhower, who, as the military commander in World War II, had a pretty good knowledge of how to apply force and how to win battles, he had authorized the development of a plan. But the plan he had authorized was much more heavily military, was designed to guarantee that the invading freedom fighters would win, and was designed to eliminate the Cuban Communist Air Force and to make it impossible for Castro to throw the freedom fighters back into the sea. At the time, there was a huge number of people who were very anti-Castro who were still in Cuba. Many of them later on fled and are living today in Miami or in New Jersey. But at the time, there was still a very large potential resistance movement inside Cuba. The Castro dictatorship was still relatively new and relatively young, and even though it was being helped by the Soviet KGB, who were teaching it how to be an effective totalitarian police state, they still had ways to go to consolidate power. And I think that had somebody like Eisenhower been in charge, he would have applied the extra pressure to make sure that if we're going to do it, I think Eisenhower's attitude would be, look, either don't do it or win. But the worst of all worlds is if you go out and start a fight, but you don't provide the resources to win it. Well, the Kennedys came in from a different angle. They wanted to replace Fidel Castro as a dictator, but they were afraid to get the U.S. too involved. And they were doing the opposite of what Eisenhower would have recommended. Instead of either using overwhelming force and winning or accepting that Castro is going to be in power, they used just enough force to be humiliated. And so the Cuban freedom fighters went ashore. The air cover we were supposed to give them off our aircraft carriers didn't show up. The Castro Air Force did show up. The Cuban army, the Castro army, was able to keep the freedom fighters close to the beach so they couldn't break through and they couldn't get into the cities. And in a matter of days, they collapsed and they had to surrender. And ultimately, we negotiated their return to the U.S. in a very humiliating way. So it was an enormous defeat for Kennedy and an enormous defeat for the United States as a country. Kennedy took from that, and he never again fully trusted the CIA, who he had empowered to do this. But on the other hand, I don't think he ever took, honestly, an assessment of what his role had been. By allowing the people who were timid to shrink the force, he increased very much the likelihood the force would fail. Now, let's go back and look at the Eisenhower model. Let's say that Kennedy had understood what Ike was doing, and Kennedy had said, you know, we're going to apply American air power, we're going to clear out the Castro Air Force. Either if it doesn't fly, we won't shoot it down, but we're just going to keep it out of the way. If they try to fly, we'll wipe them out, which we could have. There was no comparison between American air power and the Castro government at that time. And supposing he had said, we're going to make sure, if we have to, that we'll provide close air support so that our aircraft will, where necessary, take on the Castro forces. So if we had been willing to use our air power to support the brigade, I think it would have started to win, because psychologically, if they had seen that the Castro Air Force was being shot down, and they had seen that American warplanes were providing close air support and bombing and strafing the areas that had Castro soldiers, I think the morale would have collapsed pretty rapidly, because they would have known that no Castro force was going to defeat a force truly backed by the American government. Now, if that had happened, we'd be in a surprisingly different world. Fidel Castro was the very bitter enemy of America. He really wanted to take on the United States. He was the firm ally of the Soviet Union. He provided troops and doctors and other support in places like Angola and Mozambique and Nicaragua and Grenada, and he has supplied military capability that the Soviets would have found hard to replace. So a world where Castro disappeared in '61 would have been a more stable world. It would have been a world where Cuba was integrated into the Western Hemisphere rather than isolated. It'd be a world where modern Cubans had higher incomes, drove modern cars, and lived in a dramatically freer society. And in that sense, it was a tragedy that the Bay of Pigs was done so badly and so incompetently, and that the President Kennedy just didn't understand the application of power at that level. It's a great question, and I'm glad to have this chance to share these ideas. Welcome to another segment of What If? History That Could Have Been. Bill Shelton asked me a very interesting question, which is a very common question among people who study World War II, and particularly among anti-communists. And that is, what would have happened if Eisenhower had given George Patton approval to go east and defeat the Soviets? Lots of people think, well, the Americans would have won. I'm not at all sure that that's true. The Soviet army by 1945 was a very formidable army. It was physically big, many more troops than the Americans. It had the best main battle tank in World War II, the T-34. It had a very good heavy battle tank in the Stalin series, Joseph Stalin 1, 2, and 3, which were huge tanks. We had nothing comparable to either the T-34, particularly in the T-34-85, which was a T-34 with an 85 millimeter gun. Our Sherman tanks could not have stood up to it, and they produced them in huge numbers. Their air force was inadequate, and we would certainly have had control of the air, and we were very good at that. Our artillery was very, very effective at targeted firing. So if we knew where you were, we could bring artillery fire to bear. The Russians had a totally different model. The Russians just believed in putting artillery wheel to wheel and having so much of it that they just smothered an area with artillery rounds. So it was a totally different philosophy of how to fight. Now, it's important to remember, they were very successful in driving the Germans back. The bloodiest battles in World War II are Leningrad and Stalingrad. Both of them fought between the Soviets and the Germans. The great bulk of the German armies occupied in the Soviet Union. And the Soviets gradually gained control and gradually clearly become more powerful and more effective than the German army. And inch by inch began to move it back out of the Soviet Union, then out of Poland and out of Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria. I mean, sweeping. So when they finally match up with us in the middle of Germany, you have a very formidable Anglo-American army with our various allies, the Free French, the Free Poles, the Canadians, and you had a huge Soviet army. Now, it's not at all clear to me that the U.S. could have won a head-to-head fight at that point with the Soviets. It's not all clear to me that the Soviets would have won either, but they certainly would not have been a pushover. And I think a lot of people have this sense of, boy, if old George Patton had gone down that road, he would have whooped them. Well, I don't think so. I think had we stumbled into a real fight in the summer of 1945, that it would have been very bloody, very difficult, would have required us to mobilize even more forces. Plus, I'm not at all sure that our allies would have gone along with us. The British were exhausted. The French were exhausted. Soviets didn't have that problem. I mean, the Soviet model, if you're exhausted, you get shot. So very few people get exhausted. Remember also, in the summer of 1945, we're still fighting Japan. So the very period where the Germans surrender on May 8th, but the war goes on into August. So the idea of saying that President Truman, still fighting the Japanese, is somehow going to turn and agree to fight with the Soviets strikes me as just impossible. It's not going to happen. And in fact, we were doing everything we could to make the Soviets feel better. So we agreed to a terrible agreement at Yalta. We gave them ability to occupy Poland, occupy Hungary, occupy Czechoslovakia. I mean, it was really, in many ways, we were trying to appease them at that point, precisely because we didn't want to fight a war. And we frankly wanted them to move a fairly large army into Manchuria and sweep over the Japanese, which they do. They bring a very big army into Manchuria, an armored army that's very capable of moving very fast. And they decisively defeat the Japanese army just before we drop the atomic bombs. So it's a very powerful campaign, well worth studying. And it raises the question, if they could move that fast with mechanized forces, artillery and tanks, are we really that confident that George Patton's army would have been faster or more capable? And I think it's a very interesting kind of question. But certainly at the time, given that we were tired of the war, we had no interest in picking a new fight. We had every interest in having the Russians help us defeat Japan. Because remember, in the spring and early summer, we don't know if the nuclear weapon's going to work. We don't know if the Japanese are going to quit. And we thought we would suffer maybe 1 million dead if we landed in Japan and had, because of what we'd experienced in Okinawa and in Iwo Jima, we just had this sense that the Japanese would fight to the bitter end. So we actually were looking for the Russians to come in to help us defeat the Japanese. We weren't looking for an excuse to start a fight with the Russians. Now, as I said, both people who really like Patton and who admire the speed of his campaign in France and in Germany, and people who are deeply anti-communist, both kind of say, well, but boy, that would have made a big difference. I just want to say that I'm not at all convinced that that's true. My sense is that it would have been very, very difficult. The American army, and you also have to raise the question about the morale of the American troops. We've been told for 3 years that we were fighting with the Russians as our allies. Hollywood made movies that were pro-Soviet and that were designed to make you feel that Moscow was a good place. People referred to Stalin as Uncle Joe. I mean, in the summer of 1945, there was not any great underlying psychological campaign that would have gotten you to decide we want to go fight the Soviets. So I'm not sure that the American army would have responded unless the Soviets started the fight. And of course, the reality was Stalin was pretty clever. Stalin knew that he could not defeat us. He knew that we were building an atomic bomb because he had spies who were keeping him informed and getting him our nuclear secrets. He knew that we were, our strategic air force could bomb Moscow to pieces. He knew that we were very formidable. And so he wasn't going to go out of his way to start a war. He was going to, in fact, be very, very careful, which they were. Every time we got tough, they backed off because they recognized that in a relative correlation of forces, we were that much stronger than they were. So he's not going to pick the fight. Well, if they're trying to be nice, and they're not to anybody except us, they're not nice to the Poles, they're not nice to the Czechs, they're not nice to the conquered people, but they're very careful about not getting into a fight with the Americans. As long as that's going on, you have no basis for either the American people or the American soldiers, sailors, and airmen and Marines to decide they want to go fight the Russians. Remember, we'd fought World War II ferociously, in part because the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on a Sunday morning in a surprise attack, in part because we'd learned how horrible the Nazis were. But to pivot from that, after winning the war, to turn around and say, let's fight a new big war, I think would have been virtually impossible. I don't think it would have happened. It's a great question, gets you to think about that period differently, but in the end, I think we're far better off not to have ever tested that theory. Welcome to another segment of What If? History That Could Have Been, a program designed to get us to think about history, to recognize that there were many alternatives, and that it's not something just cut and dried you should memorize, but it's something you should try to understand. What were the dynamics? Why did it happen? How did the personalities matter? Now, a good friend of mine, James Farwell from New Orleans, who is a playwright, political consultant, national security analyst, remarkable guy. He has been watching the series and has sent me several ideas, one of which, ironically, was the very first novel I ever wrote. He wrote and asked, what if Hitler had not declared war in the United States? Well, way back at my very first effort at writing novels in the early 1990s, Bill Fortune, who's a great friend and a terrific writer, Bill Fortune and I conspired, along with Steve Hanser, to write a novel in which Hitler did not declare war on the U.S. At the time of Pearl Harbor. And our book was called 1945. I still get requests for it occasionally from people. And it's a small, fun kind of book that gets into what might have happened. And then would in the long run, war been inevitable between the U.S. and Nazi Germany. So I think, first of all, if Hitler had not declared war, if he had said, we're going to focus on beating the Soviet Union and Britain, we're not going to get engaged with the United States, let them fight it out with the Japanese. If after Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese on December 7, 1941, attacked the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor on a Sunday morning by surprise, which enraged the American people, and then later that day attacked the American forces in the Philippines. At that point, President Roosevelt went to the Congress and gave his famous speech about a day that will be remembered in infamy. And in that setting, the total anger of the country was focused on the Japanese. Now, I think Roosevelt, who had been working with Winston Churchill, who understood how really dangerous the Nazis were and how really dangerous Hitler was, Roosevelt believed that we should in fact make Germany our #1 target. But he couldn't have politically, in December 1941, just reached out and declared war on Germany. There was no, people weren't psychologically ready for it. Hitler did us an enormous service of declaring war on us, at which point Americans who were already really mad at the Japanese said, okay, we'll be mad at you too. And then it was pretty easy for Roosevelt, as the commander-in-chief and the chief executive officer of the United States, to take resources and make sure that we were constantly trying to put more resources into defeating Hitler. Now, let's go back then to James Farwell's question. What if Hitler had shown the wisdom of not declaring war? What would Roosevelt have done? Well, first of all of the energy of the American military machine would have been focused on the Pacific. A large part of the Atlantic Fleet would have gone to the Pacific. A large part of our air power would have gone to the Pacific. We would have begun training up the Marines and the Army to fight in the Pacific. We'd have focused on keeping open the supply line to Australia, and we would have begun to think through how to mass power to crush the Japanese as rapidly as possible. And in that process, we would just psychologically have done less for the British and less for the Soviet Union, and recognized that we were still limited because we weren't at war. It's very important to understand in the American system, because of the rule of law and because of the Constitution, once we decide we're at war, once Congress declares war, the power of the president as commander-in-chief radically increases. And so he was able, in the real world, he was able to send supplies to the Soviet Union. He was able to send supplies to Great Britain. He was able to outfit the Free French forces and to shift a large amount of our combat capability towards Europe, not Japan. He could do that once war is declared. So I think in the Farwell version, there are two possible futures, and they're both worth exploring sometime. One is Hitler doesn't declare war. We end up defeating the Japanese. Hitler ends up defeating the Russians and achieving some kind of truce with the British. And we're in a post-World War II in which our great enemy, Nazi Germany, is now beginning to think about how to attack us. That was the premise of the novel I wrote years ago with Bill Fortune called 1945. There's a second possibility. At some point over the course of 6 months or a year, Roosevelt would have continued shoving the Germans. Remember, he's already beginning in 41 to use American Navy ships to patrol the Atlantic. He's shipping equipment to Britain. He's being helpful in ways that are designed to irritate and harass the Germans and convince them that they have to attack us. So he's already trying to nibble his way into the war. It's equally likely that he would have not been able to go to war with Germany in December of 1941, as actually happened. Might have taken June, July, August of 42, and that's a very different world. By that stage, we would have had massive naval power and air power in the Pacific. We'd be at least a year behind in the buildup in Europe. The Soviets would be substantially weaker and probably may well have been pushed back more towards Central Asia. And the British would be more desperate. All those things were possible. And I think that would have been a world in which we would have collided with the Germans. Ironically, in the end, we'd have been even more powerful because as the British industrial base and the Soviet industrial base were weakened, we would have been building up more and more and more capability, and we would have clearly been the arsenal of democracy. And by 44, we have been far and away the most powerful nation in the world, which is, in fact, what really happened. It's a great question, James, and I always love hearing from you. Welcome to What If, history that could have been. And thank you for those of you who are telling your friends about it, because we keep getting more and more people signing up who are curious about thinking about history in different ways. Today I want to thank Sieg Kinthoff, who asked a very provocative question. What if Great Britain had surrendered to Hitler? Now, this is not an idle question. There are a series of books that look at 5 days in May 1940, when the British government was reeling. The head of the government, the man who had the most power, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister, realized that he could no longer serve. People had lost all faith in him. And he was the man who had gone to Munich to arrange peace in our time, as he said, with Adolf Hitler. And the collapse of peace in our time and the loss first of the Czech Republic, and then the loss, or Czechoslovakia as it was called back then, and then the loss of Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, France. The system was collapsing, and people had lost all faith in Chamberlain as a wartime leader. And at that point, there were two choices. Lord Halifax, who was a very senior, very established member of the traditional British governing class, and Winston Churchill, who was an outsider, aggressive, pugnacious, wrote a lot of books, distrusted by the British establishment, who thought that he was unsound and he was dangerous and he had too many ideas. And there was a real pressure to pick Lord Halifax. Now, Halifax knew that he couldn't get a majority in the Commons, the House of Commons, and as a member of the House of Lords, he would have to have resigned and gone to the House of Commons. And yet he was the King's first choice. What if, in fact, the King had prevailed upon Halifax, and the Tories, the Conservatives, in the House of Commons had decided they would back Halifax, which they might have done, because Churchill had no natural base of power. At one point, he was down out of 635 members, he was down to 4 during the mid-1930s. So he was seen as kind of a slightly strange, slightly too risk-taking, slightly too imaginative and adventurous person to be given real power. Halifax clearly would have negotiated an agreement with Hitler because he thought the situation was hopeless, and he thought that from the standpoint of Britain's interest, they were better off to have peace with Germany than to exhaust themselves, lose a generation of young men, burn up all of their resources trying to fight Hitler. It's a very tough, very tense moment. Luckily for Western civilization, Churchill was called upon by the House of Commons. The socialist opposition, the Labour Party, told the King they would not under any circumstance support Halifax, that Churchill was the only person they would support if there was going to be a national unity government. And so the King, with enormous reluctance, invited Churchill to come to the palace and to arrange to establish a government. So it's a magic moment, and then you have to really look at it and realize how narrow the options were. Had Halifax won and become Prime Minister, Britain would have become neutral. They would have signed an agreement with Germany. Germany would in fact have dominated them. A world in which Germany dominated Britain, and in which they could take all of their military machinery and go east against the Soviet Union, would have been a very difficult world. It would have been a world where I think the odds are pretty good that Germany would have won, with all of the horrors that implies. And of course, one of the first things Hitler would want to do would be to execute Winston Churchill, because Hitler understood how deeply, passionately anti-Nazi and anti-Hitler Churchill was. So it's a great question. It is one of the true moments in history. And there's a book by Lucas called 5 Days in May that really covers how close this was and how plausible it was that Halifax would end up with an appeasement government, cutting a deal with the Germans and frankly changing the history of the world. Great question. Welcome to another segment of What If, history that might have been. Today I'm going to answer two very different people. Mark Wheeler asked, what if the United States had not been able to acquire the Louisiana Purchase? At the same time, Mr. Somersault asked the question, what if the French had sold the Louisiana Territory to Great Britain instead of the U.S.? Now, those are kind of parallel but slightly different questions. So let's start first with whether or not the French might have sold the territory. It is possible. The French didn't particularly value it. They'd gotten it from Spain. They actually sold it to Jefferson for $15 million. So that whole huge area running all the way from the Mississippi all the way west to the Pacific, which is probably the best bargain in American history, was not seen in Paris as very important. So you can imagine, for example, during the Treaty of Amiens, which was a brief truce in 1802, the French might have decided, we'll swap you this useless piece of gigantic land for one of the islands in the Caribbean that produces sugar, which is what had happened earlier at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, where they had valued islands that produced sugar more than they valued Canada. So it's possible that would have changed things dramatically, because then you would have had the British Empire and the Royal Navy blocking the U.S. from going west. So that's a very interesting alternative history, and one that's worth our thinking about. Now, the other question is broader. What if we just hadn't been able to acquire it? What if the Spanish had taken it back? What if the French decided not to sell it? It'd be a very different America. If you get out a map and you look at America and you block off everything west of the Mississippi, we're a pretty narrow country. Now, it still would have been very big by European standards, but this gigantic, what Jefferson called the Empire of Liberty, this sense of this huge sweep to the west, all of the territory that the Lewis and Clark expedition explored and reported back on to the amazement of most Americans, the sense that we were now a country of destiny, and the whole ability to gradually pull us west and to have people migrating to the west, all of that would have been cut off. We would have been a fairly wealthy country by European standards, but we would have been a pretty normal country, bigger than any single European country except Russia, but not gigantic. It's Jefferson's brilliant acquisition of the Louisiana Territory, something which at the time was an act of extraordinary boldness. Jefferson was very frugal, did not believe in big government, vetoed a bridge over the Potomac because he didn't want to spend the money, and yet here he turns around and he buys half a continent because he has a vision that says, this is a game changer. This will make us a very different country. And I think that Jefferson, in that sense, is one of the most important of American presidents just because of his impact on our manifest destiny to go west. I think had that been cut off, first of all, Native Americans would probably have been better off and would have flourished more. And one of the real characteristics of the French in particular was they didn't send large numbers of people out. And as a result, they didn't compete for land, they didn't compete for territory from Native Americans on nearly the scale that the United States did. The United States was becoming a country which both had a huge birth rate, families of 5, 6, 7, 8 children, and a country which was attracting many, many migrants coming particularly from Western Europe. And so there was this constant hunger for land. And you had the constant pressure moving west of people who wanted to be farmers, people who wanted to take over territory. And so they were crowding Native Americans in a way that's very unlike either the British or the French traditions. So you could imagine if the United States had ended at the Mississippi River, if Louisiana and the city of New Orleans, the port through which all of the products that go down the Ohio, go down the Tennessee, go down the Mississippi, all those products go through New Orleans. If that city had remained a foreign city, that would have changed the whole commercial pattern of the United States. If people had not moved west, if you had in fact had the territories west of the Mississippi remain relatively in the hands of Native Americans, you'd have a very, very different country today. We can't quite imagine how it might have evolved, but it would make a fascinating study. For example, if we don't go west in the Louisiana territories, we never end up occupying Texas. We never end up with California. We never end up in a war with Mexico. I mean, there really are very different situations. And you could have imagined that once Mexico became independent in the 1820s, Mexico would have come north to fill the vacuum. You could also imagine that the Russians who've come across Siberia and are beginning to come down through Alaska as far south as Northern California, that the Russians began to fill the vacuum. So there are 3 or 4 different options that could have happened had the United States not had the territories west of the Mississippi. That's not how it worked out, but those were 2 really good questions, and they raised some very interesting what-if things to think about in terms of what America might have been. I'm Newt Gingrich, and this is What If, a series that looks at the question of what might have happened in history, really designed to get people to realize that history is not permanent, it's not inflexible, it's not something that had to happen, but instead, history is one of many options that could have occurred. By thinking about the what-ifs, you expand your mind's ability to deal with reality, to ask tough questions, and to think about different mechanisms and different activities. Jim Walzo wrote and asked me to talk about what if the 1979 Ayatollah Revolution had not occurred. And it's a fascinating question. In 1978, the Ayatollah Khomeini is sitting in a suburb of Paris. And even though he represents a medieval, very religious, very rigid view of the world, he has learned about modern technology. And so he is sending cassette tapes throughout Iran. It's a remarkable program, which, as somebody who used GOPAC training tapes to help modernize the Republican Party in the 80s and 90s, I have to look at that with really a sense of amazement that he was doing it in the 70s, he was doing it in very rural areas, they were being listened to by mullahs all across the country, and he was becoming famous sitting in a suburb of Paris, communicating back. He was there because the Shah would have locked him up if he could have found him. And the French protected him, just as today the French are protecting opponents to the current Iranian dictatorship. So Khomeini is creating a base that is a very religious, largely rural base. Now, the interesting question is, what if his revolution had not occurred? I think there are 2 possibilities. The Shah was at that time widely seen as pro-American and pro-modern, and in many ways was trying to create a wealthier, more modern, more urban Iranian society. But he was also a dictator, and he was running a secret police that were brutal and that deeply offended the society. So there was a substantial non-religious movement, both communist and non-communist, that wanted to overthrow the Shah. Now, in the absence of Khomeini, 2 things could have happened. One, the Shah might have survived. I mean, there have been dictators around who, by using secret police and by using bribery, have been able to survive for a very, very long time. Or 2, it would have collapsed, but not collapsed moving towards a fundamentalist dictatorship, but collapsed either moving towards a communist dictatorship or moving towards some kind of mixed movement. A lot of moderates favored democracy as well as the communist. In the 1950s, the argument had been, when Mossadegh was prime minister, that he wanted to move the country into a communist dictatorship in alliance with the Soviet Union, and that's why the United States and Great Britain basically replaced him and intervened forcefully and got him replaced in a coup d'etat. People argue that was in order to protect British and American oil interests, probably true, but it was also to block the Soviet Union from coming down and establishing a satellite that would have dominated the Persian Gulf, which was the center of the world's oil supply, with Saudi and Kuwaiti and other oil supply, as well as the Iranians and the Iraqis. So this has always been, for the last half century or more, in fact almost for 80 years now, a center of activity because of the sheer economic importance of the oil surrounded around the Persian Gulf. I think it's conceivable that in 1979 you could have had a revolution which overthrew the Shah. Remember, as late as New Year's Eve of 78 going into 79, Jimmy Carter is praising the Shah and is talking about what a wonderful person the Shah is and how America's committed to it, and is being told by the CIA that the Shah's regime is totally stable, nothing's going to happen. So what if it collapsed? If Khomeini, for some reason, either because he died or because he was stopped by the secret police. If he had not been available as a counterforce, I suspect in the end the communists were the best organized group other than the mullahs. And you probably would have ended up with a pro-Soviet Iran in 1980. What that would have led to, I don't know, but it would certainly have been a very different future, and one which threatened us in other ways. I remember being a member of Congress and going to the January 1980 State of the Union with President Carter, and basically hearing him warn the Soviet Union in the State of the Union that if they were to invade Iran, it would lead to war with the United States and potentially to nuclear weapons. And I thought, sitting in the House chamber that day, I thought, wow, this is getting really, really serious. Well, what happened, of course, was something very different. Khomeini comes back home. You have basically a rural traditionalist fight against urban modernizers. The urban modernizers lose because both the rural traditionalists are much more numerous and they're much more ferocious. Khomeini is a guy willing to kill lots of people, and he does so. In fact, he orders thousands of people killed and has no remorse about it at all. So the Communist Party of Iran finds itself being wiped out by the fundamentalists. The moderates find themselves being wiped out, imprisoned, or driven out of the country, and you end up with a Khomeini dictatorship which sees itself as the beginning of a worldwide revolutionary movement. It's very clear about that their purpose in achieving power in Iran is to be able to take their religious beliefs and spread them across the planet, and that's led for the last 39 years to the challenge we've had of trying to deal with a fundamentalist dictatorship that sees itself as a messianic movement that's prepared to use force. And according to our own State Department, even under Obama, Iran was the leading supporter of terrorism around the world. And so the fact that Khomeini did succeed had huge historic consequences. The possibilities, if he had not succeeded, are fascinating and would have been very, very different. If you find these kind of explorations of history that might have been interesting, please feel free to let your friends know and look that they can sign up for it for free. Welcome to What If? History that could have been. In this segment, I'm going to talk about the question, what if the Soviet Union had beaten the United States to the moon? It's a question raised by Philip Paul, and it's a good question. You know, it's easy to forget now because the Cold War is gone, the Soviet Union is gone. But in the early 1960s, there was a real question around the world. What was the wave of the future? Was it democratic capitalism, the rule of law, the right of free people? Or was it a centralized authoritarian system using totalitarian secret police, but brutally forcing the future by the organization of state power? The Soviets invested in space in launching Sputnik, the first satellite, Sputnik 2, and beginning to develop the first astronauts were Russian, Soviets. They weren't Americans. And there was a period in 1958 to about 1963 where it really did look like the Soviets were going to get to the moon first. One of the reasons that President John F. Kennedy launches the project to get to the moon within the decade is because he had concluded that it was a real battle of prestige, that for millions of people around the world watching to see who could put together science and technology and engineering and actually get to the moon was a signal on Earth of who might win the contest between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's a big reason why the Apollo project was launched and so much money was spent getting to the moon within the decade. Imagine for a minute that the Soviets had sustained their momentum. Now the fact is they couldn't produce the kind of rockets we could. They couldn't organize the scale we could. And once the competition became real, we were going to win. We were much bigger, much more advanced, had much greater capability. But what if they had made it? At least two ways they could have made it. One would be the United States just didn't compete very well. What if Kennedy hadn't announced we're going to get to the moon inside the decade? What if we hadn't put the scale of money into the Apollo project? What if we'd allowed them to win? I think it would have been a significant psychological victory for the Soviet Union. I think for a lot of third world countries, it would have sent a signal, bet on the future by being an ally of the Soviets. I think that it would have undermined the morale of the American people, and we would have felt that we were negotiating from weakness, not strength. So I think it's very easy, looking back, to underestimate how really, really important it was that the United States began the process of taking on the Soviets, insisting on winning this competition, and did so brilliantly, leading us within a decade to meet President Kennedy's challenge to put an American on the moon wearing an American flag. And I think that that really did significantly shift the balance of energy, the balance of power, and the sense around the world of who the leading country in the world was. So it's a great question, and I think it really reminds us there was an alternative that could have happened, and it would have been much worse for the United States.